Good morning, everyone. My name is Gyan Bhambani, and I am the host of the Entrepreneurship Insights Podcast. Today, we are here with Rohan Gupta. He's a financial markets enthusiast, a writer, and a leader. He is heavily interested in finance, economics, and technology. He's currently studying at USC and is the co-founder at Streetfins, a national financial literacy organization. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast today, Rohan.
For having me.
Yeah. So, uh, can you give us some background? How did you get started as an entrepreneur?
It's not really too long of a story. I mean, I considered myself an enthusiast at first. I still continue to consider myself an enthusiast in the markets, and it started with the investment club at high school. I was president of it, and decided to expand that out into something that could reach a lot more people. So that's how it started. Um, and yeah, from there, as you mentioned, that expansion project became known as Streetfins, and it's continuing till this day.
Wow, that's definitely inspiring. Just starting off as a high school student and just I guess you realized a gap or you realized a potential in the market. So, what do you enjoy most about just inspiring others through financial literacy through street fins?
I don't know if I would categorize it as inspiring others. I certainly want to have them learn finance. What they choose to do with it, I hope, is going to be to use it to make sensible financial decisions. I mean, that's the part that is the most satisfying, is seeing them use this knowledge to whatever it is, trade stocks or open a savings account, or just do anything that gets them involved and active with their finances. That's the most enjoyable part.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Just making or just ensuring that you have an impact and you found yours through street fins. So, we described street fins as a national financial literacy association. So, what service does it provide? Like, can you go into more detail on what service does it provide and what problem does it tackle?
Yeah, I mean, it tries to educate students. That's the service it provides. It tries to educate them through a variety of content, so articles, podcasts, videos, other types of content as well. We also have a network of high school financial education clubs, like the investment club at our high school, which I don't attend anymore, but I know you're still at it. And so, yeah, I mean, those are the two services it provides. It provides a network, and within that network, each club can connect with another club, and it can connect with its own students, and they can have competitions, they can have guest speakers, they can share content with each other, share educational content with each other. And then on the other side, we have the content that we ourselves put out, which again are our podcast, Finance Simplified, our newsletter, our articles, a whole range of content.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Just even financial literacy is so broad that you can almost do anything, right? You said you did podcasts, articles, which I also read, right? And so, how did you scale? How did your network help you scale this to incorporate many high schools across California and America?
Well, it wasn't really a network that I had at built when I started. I mean, it's stuff you do research on, you do cold outreach, and sometimes it hits. And when we reached out to not only these guest speakers, but other students at other clubs, we had to make sure that we had a good pitch for them. And thankfully, they're open minded and they wanted to join our network. So it's not a combination of an existing network. It's something that you have to go out and do cold outreach for and build yourself. So uh, it was the network itself. Building the network is what's the scaling part. It wasn't like the network helped scale something else yet. And the idea is that the network of high school clubs we're building will feed us, students who can come and contribute their knowledge through articles on the main content end. So that's where the scaling can come in. But to initially build out the network, it was just a lot of cold calling, or cold emailing rather, and our research.
Wow, it's just that it seems like to start off, you just have to put yourself out there, and for you it was cold emailing, right? You can reach out to anyone, and like you said, students and your potential guest speakers are open-minded. So students and sorry, high school students write the articles that are posted on the Streetfins website. So why did you decide it to be that way and not acclaimed investors or acclaimed financial literacy enthusiasts write that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's high school and college students, so we're trying to encompass more students as our writer base in our on our writer team. And the idea is that the students have a better chance of explaining complex financial concepts to each other rather than someone who is a professional writer and they're great at what they do, the people at the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, but they're not writing for students to understand. They're writing so that other business professionals can understand, and they have a whole different set of styles that they write. Our writing is a lot more simplistic, and not in that it's amateur writing. I mean, to a sense it is amateur because we are students, but we try to hold ourselves to the highest degree of proper journalism. In a sense, we cite all our sources, we make sure that we run everything through multiple editors on our side, and we make sure that these editors also know what financial concepts are, and have a good grounded and deep understanding of finance, and also a humble understanding of finance, because as students we still have a lot to learn. So we aren't making claims that are so definitive in our articles that that they don't reflect any kind of sense of open-mindedness or humility with what we know. So that's the reason I wanted to have it as students. It's mainly for the relatability and the simplicity with which we can explain these concepts to our peers.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Sometimes it's important if your peers are telling you the story, not people who are a generation older, right? It makes it much more relatable, and also we look forward to reading that, because we can understand, right? And that's definitely important for financial literacy since it's very complicated. And so, did you do anything before Streetfins? Like you said, you were the president of the investment club. Did you do anything else as an entrepreneur before that, or during that time period?
Yeah, I mean, there was a project I was working on with the school district, and it was basically along the same lines of peer-to-peer learning, where Streetfins is students teaching students about finance. The project I worked on before that was it was an app that tried to connect students to learn from each other in any possible subject. So not just limited to finance or economics, but just anything. So that sort of translated. I learned early on that it was more of my goal to educate students about finance specifically. I just had more of an inclination towards doing that. So that's where I, transitioned to Streetfins from that project.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's like just um, finding that you can finding that you like to educate, and then boiling down to exactly what you wanted, what your passions were, what you wanted to just give to the world. Right? And you said that you developed, or you and the district were developing an app. Um, how did that turn out, and what was its impact?
Well, the app didn't really go anywhere. If the district was sort of I'm not allowed to really say too much about this, but it was sort of a mutual agreement that we came to, that the app would not be as uh, as usable as we thought it would be by the students, simply because there are some alternatives out there, and there's a lack of um, there's a lack of how would I describe it? The lack of broad interest amongst the student body. That was one part of it. And then there's also the district wanted to try some other things out instead of that, even though we were working on it sort of as we were getting advice from them, but it was more of a, while we were working with them, they were more so like who we thought our first customer would be, in a sense, or first type of user. But we it just didn't go as far as we planned for it to go. So that's just people have different projects. The project's outcomes aren't realized. You can consider it a failure. I don't consider it as much of a failure because I still learned a lot. I learned how to code. I learned how to manage teams. All that was really vital for Streetfins, which I think is a lot more successful than the other app projects. So it's an experience. It's not necessarily something I look back and say was a complete failure or anything, because I mean, a lot of people have made quotes in the past about how you can look at failure not as failure but just as a learning opportunity, and that's a very optimistic way to look at it, but and I think it's also the right way to look at it too. So that's how I view it.
Wow, just being able to learn from your failures is really important, right? Having that sort of growth mindset. And you said you learned how to code and also how to manage teams efficiently, right? So uh, you mentioned it slightly, but about that experience, but how did leaving that and venturing off to Streetfins really help you?
Yeah, I mean, when we transitioned, it was a similar type of focus where we're trying to connect students to in a way that would help each other learn, specifically finance. So the mission was pretty much, it was quite similar in that we wanted to promote peer learning amongst the topic of finance rather than just a broader topic. So a lot of transferable things. There was obviously we weren't making an app for the Streetfins. We were doing more so more people focused, where it was a network and we have our own content and trying to make it a network that people want to be part of. So a little bit different there, but overall, like, you can transfer a lot of things, especially in the team building stuff. And the fact that we were all initially very eager to jump into learning how to write these articles because we always read them for investment club and our own sort of personal investment interests. So there's an eagerness to learn something new, which was the writing, the content creation piece of it, along with the mission that kind of transferred over. So that's where that's how I described the transition.
I can't help but realize that you mentioned passion, like that eagerness to learn. Could you go into more detail on how maybe that factor was less important or more important than the others in helping you create and grow Streetfins?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be interested in something you dedicate a lot of time to. So I think the question kind of answers itself. Like, it was probably the most important thing. Otherwise, without it, I mean, especially, you're not doing this as a full-time job in a sense. Like, some jobs you don't really enjoy and you just go because it's high paying or it's the only option available. But I mean, I'm a college student. I mean, in high school I had other options too, but the reason I wanted to stick to Streetfins was because I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the learning that came along with it. When you're trying to teach something to others, whether it's writing or one-on-one tutoring or making an episode on a podcast about it, it always makes you sort of do your research yourself and simplify it yourself before you teach it to others. So you become a better explainer when you become a better teacher, and you also learn the information faster and you learn it better when you teach it. So that was an exciting thing, and I really enjoyed the satisfaction that came from that. Um, yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I think the question answers itself. I think passion and interest in what you're doing is probably the most important thing. Otherwise, you won't have a sustainable reason to do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Just being able to, because that passion is going to stick with you uh, even when nothing else does, right? And so you mentioned briefly that you had that Streetfins also has a podcast which you host where you interview um, other uh, other entrepreneurs and other investors and everyone in that investing and finance field about their work. How did that come about? How did you start that as a part of Streetfins?
Yeah, well, it kind of comes from the investment club. So with the investment club, the first year I was part of it, I was in charge of bringing guest speakers. So we brought in an in-person guest speaker. He was the highest profile guest speaker by far that we had. He was a pretty rich venture capitalist. And I thought that, and then the next year, and that was an in-person guest speaker, that first one we had. The next year, we had 4 guest speakers, one of whom was also a very prominent name, and those are all virtual. So then senior year, we had another virtual guest speaker, but I started the podcast in my senior year, and I just felt like a natural transition to make a greater volume of conversations that are centered around investing with these prominent names, and they could also be more focused on a topic rather than a Q&A about any random topic or any random question that comes from a club, because those were all Q&As. And so, yeah, that's how it developed. I think it was just naturally transitioned from in-person guest speaker to virtual guest speaker to podcasts.
I couldn't, like, it's just, yeah, because it was natural, like from investment club, just asking questions, it's the same sort of strategy that you use, but it's more focused and more deliberate, right? So how did you scale that properly, and how did you build a reliable audience? Because that is usually an issue for creators who are just starting.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to close my window. I think I hear some sounds from it. I'll be back in just 2 seconds. Yeah. So in regards to the podcast, Finance Simplified, podcasts are a very crowded space, especially the ones that are about more intellectual things like, finance, financial literacy. Everyone's trying to be, the next Joe Rogan or the next, it's just a very crowded space. But, when we try and make sure we have an audience that is very dedicated to learning these concepts, so they just naturally kind of find this. So it's good because we don't necessarily have to promote this all the time. We make our posts about it on social media when they release, and then a few days after with like some snippets. But I'd say it's been mostly like natural. People just search up, finance podcasts to listen to, or they search up a guest that we've had on, and we have had on plenty of like really top names in the industry. I mean, billionaires, academics that are pretty well known. Like we had a Nobel Prize winner on. We've had, like I mentioned, billionaires, CEOs of very, well-funded startups, and, people who were just absolutely killing it in the industry. So people search those names up, and then they find that we've done an interview with them, and then they just kind of listen to that. So right now, compared to some of these other podcasts that have been around for years, and that have people working full time on them, our podcast just recently hit 30 episodes, and that was over the course of, that's basically since October of 2019. So that isn't necessarily that much for a podcast compared to like Bloomberg's Masters in Business or some other podcast where it's a full time, it has, plenty of other people backing it. But for what we've done so far, given that we go for quality over quantity in a sense, so that's what it's sort of a limited option that we have to do because we're students, and we have a lot of other time commitments, and making an episode we put a lot of time into each episode, and each half of an episode, because we release one interview in 2 chunks or 2 episodes, so part 1 and part 2. But overall, it's just been naturally that people find us. And I talked to some people who in college who say, oh yeah, I saw that podcast post that you did, and it was on your story or it was on your LinkedIn or whatever, and I started listening, and I think it's really good. So that's really always great. And but that means I think that they would have found it organically. Otherwise they would have just searched it up because they're just naturally interested in that stuff. So I think, just making something that naturally is interesting is the best way to build a reliable audience.
Yeah, man. It's sometimes it's really hard to hard to put out interesting content, but once you do, you can actually build, like you said, a reliable audience, right? Like I've also had that experience, like kids coming up to me, like students coming up to me, and they're like, "Oh, I listened to this episode of your podcast, right?" And it's shocking, but also I'm pretty sure it makes you also happy to know that you're making a true impact. So, where do you see yourself? Sorry, where do you see yourself with the podcast in a few years? Do you see exploring anything else in that podcast field, utilizing your audience to do anything else?
I mean, the only thing I want to utilize the audience for is to spread the message or spread the podcast to others, because some people will naturally do that, and some people just kind of see the podcast as something that is not necessarily the most top thing that they listen to, and that they won't necessarily be as serious about helping us as the creators of the podcast, spreading the message. So hopefully, the audience will grow with time and will be more passionate about sharing it. And that's what every podcast really hopes for, is that natural sort of viral way to grow. Where do I see myself with the podcast? Well, the whole idea is that the podcast will be run by students, and that's just the philosophy that we hold. I think it's just powerful and almost sort of magical that we can create that and really push forth, because it shows that students are capable of, learning on their own. We don't necessarily need the hyper there's always some kind of agenda with many of these financial news organizations, and so or like these people who claim that they're the best source of financial wisdom, but they're just one person, and that's just not really true. So whenever we can, we try to make sure that not only is it the messages or the sort of philosophy that we're following is that we're always going to stay student run, because that's the most relatable, but we're also going to be collectively student run, meaning no one student is going to ever be like the main sort of arbiter of Streetfins or information. Like for me, it's me and then my co-host as well. And then we also have a whole incredible team of students behind, helping with the podcast, both college students and high school students. We have someone else who writes our newsletter. We have a bunch of different writers. So it's all a collection of students, not just one student or one personality behind that, because we frankly don't think that's the right way to go about learning. You don't learn from one personality, you learn from a bunch, especially with finance. I mean, let's say with physics, you can just find a really smart physicist who might learn and know everything, all the equations and everything, but that's because physics is more or less finite. Finance is not finite, it's always changing. And so you need a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different ways to say something is simple. And so what that means for me going forward is that eventually, once I am no longer a student, I'm no longer the most relatable voice, I will pass the podcast down to another student who will be hopefully, thinking more or less along, they'll have their own sort of unique way to have a conversation, but it'll also be focused on education, and not something else. Our podcast, Finance Simplified, will always be about simplifying and explaining financial concepts in the most relatable and easy way to understand, with the most exciting and intriguing guests.
Yeah, I really don't know what to say, man. So, that was truly, I guess, insightful, because just being able to, like you said, pass down or give the most interesting information in the most engaging way possible. That's really important, especially in the podcast world, because no one really has time, like half an hour, 40 minutes to sit down and listen to one whole thing, right? So that's honestly really interesting. So as we near the end of our interview, as we are near the end of our interview, what advice do you have for teens thinking of entering the entrepreneurship field or the financial literacy field, just being investing in venture capital and so on and so forth?
So for people who want to be an entrepreneur, I would just say you have to be humble about it. You have to understand that you might think you have a good idea, and that it's a good that you might want to pursue it for whatever reason. But you have to always stay humble and know that you're not you're not you know you can have a founded startup and you might think it's so innovative, but whenever you're trying to talk to other people, never come off as too full of yourself. That's the first thing. And never think that what you're doing is like um is going to be like the most world changing thing ever, because there's always going to be things that change the world. There's always going to be some person who's always trying to like one up you or anything. But the key is just to stay humble with that. I haven't There's so many stories of people who I've met who think that they're changing the world, and when I really talk to them, and they're not. They're just very much just full of themselves. They think that they're entitled to success. And so I would say you have to make sure that you're not going to stay entitled to that success. And with that, that comes humility, being willing to not to kind of view yourselves objectively, and say that what you're doing is might work. It's not going to work, and you're not going to be this world changing thing. And so you have to like carefully. It kind of is my philosophy. I mean, I don't know if everyone else agrees, but you have to just stay humble, and you can't be entitled. That's the one thing I would say, because many people will, and that leads to both. If you're entitled, you might achieve something with that, but it wouldn't really be the right way to achieve it, in my opinion. And then with regards to students who are wanting to get interested in financial literacy, I would say that just because you day traded during the pandemic or you got rich from Robinhood does not mean you're a great investor. Because if everyone else is getting rich around you, that doesn't mean that if you just simply click the buy button at that point. Yes, it means you're keeping track of things, but that's not what a good investor does, because a good investor will beat his peers and get better returns than them. So and then that ties into humility and being willing to learn more and not being really full of yourself. And again, it's a lot of students I've talked to think that they're the best investors ever just because they made money once, and in truth, they are struggling to find how to make money again, rather than and they did them, but that's not what an actual investor does. An investor is trying to find opportunities to always make money, with the markets, not just one-off things like Robinhood or day trading or whatever it is. So yeah, I guess the advice goes to both of those types of people, both looking to be entrepreneurs and both looking to be financially literate. Just be humble and don't be entitled.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. Just being able to step back, look at yourself, like you said, from an objective stance, and not and just not be full of yourself, right? Because no one likes people who are full of themselves, right? Just being able to, uh, being re- being able to grow properly with the peers, with your peers. That's really important. And so, what advice do you have for students about using their time, their relationships, and their opportunities to take advantage of their passions?
Um, just honestly, it's different for everyone. So I would just say, you have to figure out for yourself, like, if you really enjoy something and you think you can make some kind of project out of it, I would say go ahead and try it. Make sure that it's not going to be the biggest time suck of your life, because you have to enjoy other things in life. In college, a lot of students, uh, there's two types of students in college who I'm sort of recognizing: those who are always just knee deep in work and always trying to work on passion projects, and they don't have time for anything else, and the students who actually have a sort of a more well balanced aspect. And then there's another sort of third type of student who is like the opposite of the person knee deep in work, who just has tons of free time, just partying all the time. But you have to like sort of figure out that right balance. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Don't beat yourself up for it. Um, Obviously try and learn what you can from it, but a lot of times, like, it's just bad luck, or market timing is off, or this project isn't necessarily like gonna fit with like your initial target market for it. it's there's a lot of factors that go into it that are kind of out of your control. So again, just don't beat yourself up for it, and just enjoy other parts of life outside of just going, just working really, really hard, because or just grinding really hard on your personal passion project. Because some people will respect that, but come time when you want to actually look back at like the relationships you've built, and like just realize what you've talked about with them, and you see that all you've been talking about with them is like your personal passion project and nothing else. You don't talk about sports or maybe relationships or whatever it is. You're going to realize that you should have spent more time on that, and maybe toned it down a little bit on the passion project end, because you have your whole life to work on passion projects, especially if you have a job that you like. You have your whole life, and even outside of the time for your job, you can always work on those. But if you're a student right now, enjoy things that a student should enjoy, right? Like just exploring everything, and being more well balanced than singularly minded and singularly focused with your time.
Wow, I again, I don't know what to say, man, because it's just that entrepreneurship in general, and really life in general, is about just finding a balance between, like in this case it was passion projects and your other relationships, your social life and everything like that. And I guess finding that is truly important, because like you said, when you look back, you're gonna realize you are going to regret what you didn't do or what you did do, right? So that's awesome. Would you like to close with any ending remarks? Just like if whatever, like what you really want our listeners to get out of this podcast, out of this episode today.
So closing remarks. Let's see. What have I not said already? I mean, yeah, I think what I just said earlier, being humbled and being not entitled to anything will serve you very well in this life. Um, Especially with you when you're trying to build relationships and you're meeting with people who obviously know a lot more than you. If you act like you're better than them, or like you deserve something that they earned and you just want to have, then they're just going to immediately just not talk to you anymore. And so, yeah, I'd say those would be the fair two things. And for anyone listening, check out my podcast, Finance Simplified, if you have any interest in becoming financially literate. We were recently put on a list of this happened organically too. We didn't push for it or anything. We were put on a list of one of the best podcasts about finance to listen to in 2021, and so we're on that list. So it's you could just search it up. I'm not going to bore you with like the source or anything right now. If you want to verify it, you can. Otherwise, you can take me at my word for it. Yeah, check that podcast out if you want to, start learning finance in a very simplified way. Again, we have really cool guests on it. We had our most famous guest is Anthony Scaramucci, who was he was in the Trump administration for those fabled 11 days. We've also had people who are very well connected in the industry. A guy named Howard Marks, who's one of my favorite guests, and he's so smart, and he's a billionaire, and he actually is respected a lot by Warren Buffett. So, we bring on some really great names. And so if that interests you at all, feel free to check it out. Just Finance Simplified on any podcast platform you have. And I guess a closing thing would be, just there's a lot of push towards, having like especially in the Bay Area and, parts of, New York, like hustle culture, grind culture, super big. Just ignore that, you don't have to do something just for the sake of saying that you're a hustler, or you grind out and you grind out work and you're hustling for that success or anything. That very rarely works. And the people who kind of push for that on social media or anything are not as successful as you'd think. And so, yeah, I would say be cognizant of that. And and be a little skeptical of that too. So yeah, that would be my final 3 pieces of advice. Just taking it a little bit easier than you might have previously thought to.
Yeah, our society puts out this, like, especially through social media, it puts out this image that everyone's just grinding, like you said, all the time, and it motivates you also to do the same. But sometimes we need to take everything, or we need to take some things with a grain of salt. And so I guess that wraps up our interview. And thank you, Rohan, for taking the time out of your schedule to just give us some insight into how you got started, your entrepreneurial and your financial literacy journey, and just your visions for the future. And definitely check out the Finance Simplified podcast. Go subscribe to the Streetfins newsletter. Check out their articles. I found my inspiration through that. And with that, have a wonderful day, you all. Thank you.